Just wait until WWDC, they said. That's when we'll see what the M1 iPad can really do. That just didn't happen, did it? Welcome back to Ellis Reviews, and thank you as always for subscribing if you have, and if you haven't, the button's down there somewhere. So this channel is pretty much completely self-funded. I say pretty much because occasionally I get things sent to me to review. However, one company that obviously doesn't do that is Apple. I have to buy all the Apple gear myself. This isn't a plea to Apple, they're not watching this, but it's just the reality of this channel. And what that means is that I have to really think about the tech that I buy in to review. For instance, I wouldn't really have bought the AirPods Max. They're very expensive for a pair of consumer headphones, but I bought them in to review for you guys. I probably wouldn't have bought the 24-inch M1 iMac, but I did. I'm glad I did. But I just can't think of a reason at the moment to buy the M1 iPad Pro. And I talked about this when it was first launched. I'll put a link in the video description to that video. And I described it as the most boring product release Apple has ever made. Some people agreed with me, some people vehemently disagreed with me. But the people who did disagree with me were making some very good points. One of them being the fact that we should wait until WWDC this year just to see what Apple does with iPadOS, because surely at that point they were going to do something with it that would unleash the power of this M1 chip that's in the new iPad Pro. They didn't. So I still have no way to make use of the M1 iPad Pro's full power. Am I being unfair? Possibly. Possibly not. Let me explain a few reasons why I will not buy the M1 iPad Pro at the moment. I actually really enjoyed WWDC this year. I think what they're doing with iOS and macOS and the privacy stuff is really impressive. A lot of the new features were okay, fairly obvious iterations of existing features, but you know, FaceTime, for example, is becoming, well, it looks like it's going to be the new Zoom, and they're doing some really cool stuff with macOS Monterey and the way that it links up with the iPad, which brings me on to iPadOS 15. Now, if we go onto Apple's preview page for iPadOS 15, we're told that we'll soon be able to take the iPad's versatility even further. That sounds quite exciting, but to Apple, that basically means slightly better multitasking, widgets, quick notes, FaceTime updates, focus modes, and a few other bits and pieces they've done with Safari and Maps, which are all quite interesting, but fairly run-of-the-mill. However, what's interesting is if you scroll right down to the bottom of the page and look at the iPads that iPadOS 15 is compatible with, it's just this massive list, and it goes right the way back to the iPad Air 2. I've got no problems with backwards compatibility. I think if you're holding on to an old iPad, it's nice to know that the new version of iPadOS is going to work on it. But what's missing from that list, I think, is something at the top that says this feature or these features are only available with the M1 iPad Pro. There's nothing along those lines, though. And actually, if we think back to the WWDC keynote, I don't think the M1 iPad Pro was mentioned at all. So the comments on my last video about the M1 iPad Pro, they said it all really. There was a very common narrative running through the entire comment thread. And it was things like, wait until WWDC, you've got this all wrong. WWDC is the moment when we're going to see what this iPad can do. I bought this iPad because I know what's coming at WWDC. You just wait until WWDC. But just like all the hardware rumors leading up to WWDC, which hands up, admittedly, I completely got myself lost in, nothing happened with iPadOS 15 that was really momentous or which is befitting of that M1 chip in the iPad Pro. There was a glimmer of hope at one point actually, which was the universal control section in macOS Monterey. That's where Craig Federighi did this fantastic, brilliant demonstration of dragging a piece of content from an iPad through a MacBook that was in the middle of this setup, completely pointlessly, and eventually onto an iMac and into a timeline on Final Cut Pro. And he did that all with the same trackpad, and it was just mind-blowing. And at that point I thought, hang on a minute, this is the thing that the iPad Pro with the M1 chip, this is what it's made for. Surely you need some horsepower to do that. And maybe there's some kind of extension stuff going on where you're offloading some of the processing that is taking place on the Mac onto the iPad. How cool? No, not at all. Actually, if you look at what you need to make that work, you can even do it on the 3rd generation iPad Air and the 5th generation iPad mini. You don't need the M1 iPad Pro to use universal control. It's actually compatible with a huge range of existing iPads. So it was just another iterative iPadOS release. Nothing particularly exciting, some nice little features. But the key thing for me was that there was just nothing in there to make me want to go out and buy an M1 iPad. This is my trusty 2018 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and I love it. It's got a D-brand skin on it. It's not really battered and bruised, actually. I've really looked after this. I've been very careful with it. It's superb, and it feels, crucially, as quick as the day I bought it. There's no sluggishness. The fact it has the high refresh rate screen, that makes it feel snappy anyway, but it's so powerful. I know I'm not using anywhere near the processing power that sits in this thing. The most intensive thing I do these days, this has recently become my photo editing device of choice, if you like. So for all my photos, for the thumbnails for these videos, photos for my blog, I use the iPad Pro from 2018 and Lightroom Mobile to edit those photos. They're RAW files, they come out of my Canon 5D Mark III, which is at the back of the studio, and it handles the editing process perfectly. It never slows down, it doesn't stutter, it doesn't crash, and I always get the feeling that the edits I'm doing aren't really pushing this at all. And the reason I started using the iPad Pro as a photo editing tool was because I watched a Peter McKinnon video. I watched him do this silent video where he just basically edited a bunch of his photos. I'll leave a link to it actually in the video description because it's a brilliant example of a piece of content where he just doesn't say anything and he reviews this device silently. But the way he was editing his videos on it just really inspired me. So I thought, well, hang on a minute, let's give that a go on the 2018 iPad Pro and just see how I get on. And like I say, it's fantastic. So there's still no reason for me to buy that M1 iPad Pro. At this point, you might be asking, quite understandably, what on earth I want from this M1 iPad Pro. And I've thought about this quite a lot because for me, the iPad has always really been a consumption device. I've used it for writing, which isn't particularly taxing really. And like I say, now it is a photo editing tool. But generally speaking, I use it to watch YouTube, to read websites, catch up on social media and all that sort of stuff. So it's been a consumption device for me. But ever since the M1 iPad Pro came out, and I've looked at your comments and I've listened to other commentary and got other people's opinions on it, I've kind of formed what I think is my idea of where I think the iPad should go next, for me, completely selfishly. And the reason I've been thinking about this more wholesomely now is because the world is slowly opening up again, and it does mean that we can get out there and do work out on the road. And I'm a huge coffee shop user, so I do a lot of my work in coffee shops. I used to do quite a bit of editing, video editing in coffee shops as well. Now at the moment, admittedly, I don't really have a fantastic device for that. I do have the M1 MacBook Air, which, as I've said before, is great for video editing, but I only have the 8GB version, and although it works, it's okay. I wouldn't want to put a lot of stress on that in terms of, you know, weekly video editing. However, if I could have a really powerful iPad, which in some way lets me take my entire Final Cut Pro workflow from my Mac behind me, so that's the M1 Mac Mini behind me, which is the only thing at the moment I edit videos on. If I could transfer the Final Cut Pro workflow seamlessly onto my iPad, take the iPad down to the coffee shop, continue working on my edit, bring it back, somehow transfer it back there seamlessly and finish it off and render it and export it and upload it to YouTube, that would be amazing. I don't know how that would work. Technically there's a lot of things that have got to go on there in terms of file transferring and proxy files and all that sort of stuff. But it's clear that one of the most common wishes for this M1 iPad is Pro apps. People want Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro, the full version of Xcode, etc. That hasn't happened yet. If Apple does that, if they make it seamless, like I say, so you can take your workflow from a Mac onto your M1 iPad, that gets me interested. I'd buy one now if that was the case. Given what happened at WWDC, that feels like quite a long way off. There are two things that I've written and talked about quite a bit this year, which have attracted more attention and more comments on both sides of the fence than pretty much anything else, even including the M1 chip. And that is the Apple TV. I'll leave a link to my most recent video about that above, but also the M1 iPad Pro. These two products have very fiercely loyal fan bases, which I completely understand. And it also means that the people who love the iPad Pro and who are very, very happy with that M1 version of it now being available, it means they've got lots of ideas on where it could go. So again, I'd love you to contribute to this and tell me what you want from that M1 iPad Pro. Firstly, when it came to iPadOS 15, were you disappointed? Or can you see a glimmer of hope there somewhere? And as I say, what do you want to see this M1 iPad Pro do? Get involved in the comments. If you want to see my full reaction to WWDC this year, keep watching for a link to the video where I go through every announcement pretty much that they made. But in the meantime, thank you as always for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.